My dear friends, tonight I share a true story from the archives of the church, one I've pieced together from old diocesan records and hushed conversations with priests who stood in the fire of spiritual battle. To protect the family involved, I've given them new names: George, Harriet, Michael, and Robbie Mannheim. But the events are real, rooted in a case from St. Louis, Missouri in 1982. This is not a tale for the faint of heart, but a testament to the power of faith when darkness creeps into the lives of the unsuspecting. Let's begin. It was the summer of 1982 in a quiet suburb of St. Louis, where the air was thick with the hum of cicadas and the scent of freshly cut grass. The Mannheim family lived in a two-story wooden house on Maryland Avenue, a street lined with maple trees and modest homes, where neighbors waved from porches and kids played stickball until dusk. George Mannheim, a 42-year-old civil engineer, was the steady anchor of the family. A man of German descent, he had a meticulous nature, always carrying a leather-bound notebook where he jotted down schedules and details of bridge and road projects downtown. His hands, calloused from years of drafting blueprints and inspecting construction sites, told the story of a man who built things to last. But beneath his reserved demeanor, George carried a quiet unease about the world shifting around him, the aftershocks of the 1970s counterculture, the rise of strange new ideas that seemed to pull people away from the church and into uncharted waters. He loved his wife and children fiercely, though his love was shown in actions, not words: a fixed faucet, a new bike for the boys, a silent prayer before bed. Harriet, his wife of 38 years, was the warmth of the household. A third-grade teacher at St. Agnes, the local Catholic school. She had a smile that could calm a room and a gift for turning Bible stories into adventures that held her students spellbound. Whether it was David facing Goliath or Moses parting the Red Sea, Harriet made faith feel alive, like a fire that warmed without burning. She taught catechism on weekends, her gentle voice guiding children through the mysteries of the Rosary, and her faith was unshakable, rooted in a trust that God's plan unfolded even in life's messiest moments. Their two sons, Michael and Robbie, were as different as night and day. Michael, 16, was the outgoing one, a high school junior with dreams of playing baseball for Notre Dame. His room was a shrine to the St. Louis Cardinals, with posters of Ozzie Smith and a well-worn glove on his desk. Robbie, 12, was quieter, a shy boy who buried himself in science fiction novels, Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, and tinkered with an old transistor radio to catch late-night broadcasts about UFOs and extraterrestrial mysteries. He was the kind of kid who asked questions adults couldn't answer, his curiosity a spark that burned bright but unnoticed. The Mannheims were a family woven into the fabric of St. Agnes Parish. George sang tenor in the Sunday choir, his deep voice blending with the organ's hum. Harriet taught Sunday school, her lessons filled with stories of saints and miracles. Michael and Robbie served as altar boys, their white albs crisp as they carried candles during Mass. It was a life of routine, of faith, of community, a life that felt safe, predictable, like the steady rhythm of the Mississippi River flowing just miles away. But evil, my friends, doesn't always announce itself with thunder and shadow. Sometimes it slips in quietly through the smallest crack, waiting for an invitation. That invitation came in the form of a package from New Orleans, sent by Harriet's older brother, Luther, a wanderer and former merchant marine who'd spent his life chasing the horizon. Luther was a man of contradictions, a sailor with a poet's heart, a skeptic who dabbled in the occult, collecting strange artifacts from ports across the world. He died in a shipwreck off the Florida coast earlier that year, a tragedy that left Harriet grieving and the family shaken. Among his belongings, sent to the Mannheims after his death, was a wooden Ouija board, its surface etched with letters and symbols, a relic from the French Quarter's shadowed shops. Luther had meant it as a gift for Robbie, knowing the boy's fascination with the unknown. Just a harmless toy, the note read, scrawled in Luther's looping handwriting. Robbie, wide-eyed and curious, hid the board under his bed, pulling it out on sleepless nights to trace its letters with his fingers, whispering questions into the dark. He didn't know, how could he, that some doors, once opened, are hard to close. At first, the signs were subtle, easy to dismiss. It started with soft taps on the walls of Robbie's room, like the patter of late summer rain. He'd lie awake, his radio silent, listening as the knocks grew louder, more insistent, moving from the walls to the floorboards beneath his bed. "It's just the house settling," George would say, his engineer's mind seeking logic in the creaks of an old home. But Robbie, with a child's intuition, felt something more. He began to speak of dreams, vivid, unsettling dreams, where a voice, low and gravelly, called him, "My little Robbie." The voice didn't frighten him at first. It felt like a friend, a secret companion who knew his name and promised answers to the questions that burned in his young mind. Harriet, ever the optimist, thought it was imagination, the kind of fanciful stories kids tell when they're grappling with grief. George, less patient, told Robbie to stop reading those damn sci-fi books before bed. But the dreams didn't stop, and neither did the knocks. By early fall, as the leaves on Maryland Avenue turned crimson and gold, the disturbances grew harder to ignore. Objects began to move. George's favorite leather armchair, a heavy piece he'd bought after his first big promotion, would slide a few inches across the living room each morning, as if someone had nudged it in the night. Harriet's books, her collection of C.S. Lewis and catechism guides, tumbled from their shelves, pages splayed open on the floor, even though the windows were locked tight. The family's black and white cat, Whiskers, refused to enter Robbie's room, hissing at the doorway before bolting downstairs. Robbie himself was changing. The shy boy who once trailed Michael like a shadow became withdrawn, his eyes darting nervously, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. He stopped eating dinner with the family, pushing his plate away with a scowl, and snapped at Michael when the older boy teased him about his radio shows. "It's not me," Robbie muttered one night, his voice barely audible as he stared at the floor. "It's something else." Harriet, with her teacher's patience, chalked it up to adolescence, perhaps the lingering pain of losing Uncle Luther. She took Robbie to Dr. Evelyn Harper, a pediatrician at Barnes Jewish Hospital, a sharp-witted woman in her 50s with round glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor. Dr. Harper ran tests, blood work, a physical exam, even a neurological scan, but found nothing wrong. "Emotional stress," she concluded, prescribing rest and family time. But Harriet wasn't convinced. Late at night, she'd wake to strange sounds from Robbie's room, not the usual creaks of a growing boy, but something deeper, guttural, like the growl of a dog cornered in an alley. One night, she crept down the hall and found Robbie sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide and unblinking, whispering words she couldn't understand, words that sounded like Latin, a language he'd never studied. The air in his room was heavy, thick with a sulfurous stench that made her gag. She clutched her rosary, praying silently, but the smell lingered, seeping into the hallway like a warning. George, ever the practical man, refused to entertain thoughts of the supernatural. He checked the house for gas leaks, called a plumber to inspect the pipes, even installed a bulky security camera in the hallway, a grainy 1980s model that recorded nothing but static. But the disturbances persisted. Glasses shattered in the kitchen, their fragments arranged in neat circles on the counter. The thermostat spiked to 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the middle of October, leaving the family sweating in their sleep. George, who'd always prided himself on his control, began to unravel. After work, he'd sit in the garage with a six-pack of Budweiser, staring at the wall as if answers might appear in the wood grain. He didn't tell Harriet, but he'd started hearing the knocks too, not just in Robbie's room, but in his own, a rhythmic tapping that followed him into his dreams. The parish community, tight-knit and devout, began to notice the strain. At street, Agnes, whispers spread among the congregation. "Something's wrong with the Mannheims," they'd say after Mass, their voices low as they sipped coffee in the church basement. Harriet, desperate for guidance, turned to Father Raymond Bishop, the 55-year-old pastor of Street Agnes. Father Bishop was a towering figure, his voice warm and resonant, like the sermons that drew crowds every Sunday. He'd seen his share of strange cases during his missions in Chicago in the 1960s, but he was skeptical of teenage pranks masquerading as spiritual crises. Still, when Harriet poured out her fears, Robbie's dreams, the moving objects, the unnatural sounds, Father Bishop agreed to visit. What he saw shook him. Robbie, pale and trembling, sat in the living room, his eyes clouded as if a storm brewed behind them. When Father Bishop recited the Hail Mary, Robbie's lips twisted into a sneer, his voice warping into something mocking, guttural, spitting the prayer back in a distorted chant. The room grew cold, the air heavy with that same sulfurous odor. Father Bishop clutched his breviary, his knuckles white, and wrote in his journal that night, "This is no child's game. Something ancient is testing us. I've seen this pattern before. My friends, evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, probing for weakness, waiting for us to lower our guard." The Mannheims didn't know it yet, but their battle was just beginning, and it would test the strength of their faith, their love, and their will to stand against a darkness older than time. By October, the air in Street Louis carried the crisp bite of fall, and the Mannheim house, once a haven of warmth, felt like a place under siege. The disturbances were no longer confined to Robbie's room. In the kitchen, Harriet found her cast iron skillet, a wedding gift from her mother, hanging from the ceiling light, swaying gently as if placed there by invisible hands. The family's old radio, Robbie's prized possession, would crackle to life at odd hours, spitting static laced with garbled voices that seemed to whisper names George, Harriet, Michael before falling silent. The cat, Whiskers, had taken to hiding in the basement, its fur bristling whenever it passed the staircase. Harriet, whose faith had always been her anchor, began to feel a weight pressing on her chest, a sense that something was watching, waiting. She'd wake in the middle of the night, her rosary beads clutched so tightly they left marks on her palms, and pray for protection. But the prayers felt hollow, as if her words were being swallowed by the air itself. Robbie, the 12-year-old boy who once lost himself in science fiction, was slipping away. His face, once soft and curious, grew gaunt, his eyes shadowed with dark circles that made him look older than his years. He stopped going to school, claiming headaches that no aspirin could touch. At night, he'd sit cross-legged on his bed, staring at the Ouija board he'd hidden under a loose floorboard. He hadn't touched it since the first disturbances, but he swore it moved on its own, the planchette sliding across the letters in the moonlight, spelling words he didn't dare repeat. "It knows me," he told Michael one evening, his voice flat, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on his arm. Michael, 16 and full of teenage bravado, tried to laugh it off, but the sight of his little brother, once his shadow, now a stranger, sent a chill down his spine. "You're just freaking yourself out," Michael said, but his voice wavered. That night, he heard Robbie muttering in his sleep, words that sounded like a chant, sharp and rhythmic, in a language that made the hair on his neck stand up. George, the engineer who built his life on logic, was fraying at the edges. He'd always been a man of solutions, but no amount of tinkering could fix what was happening. The security camera he'd installed caught nothing but flickering shadows, yet the disturbances grew bolder. One morning, he found his toolbox, 20 pounds of steel and wrenches, stacked neatly on the dining room table. The lid open, tools arranged in a perfect spiral. He stopped sleeping, his night spent pacing the garage with a beer in hand, the bottles piling up in the trash. He didn't tell Harriet about the whispers he'd started hearing, not just knocks now, but a low, guttural voice calling his name from the walls. "George," it hissed, "you can't protect them." He'd shake his head, blaming exhaustion, but the fear was sinking in, a cold realization that this was beyond his control. Harriet turned to the church, as she always had in times of trouble. She met Father Raymond Bishop after Mass one Sunday, her hands trembling as she described the changes in Robbie, the dreams, the muttering, the way his eyes seemed to follow something unseen. Father Bishop, a seasoned priest with a voice like rolling thunder, had seen troubled teens before. In his Chicago days, he dealt with kids dabbling in the occult, their antics more rebellion than supernatural. But something in Harriet's voice, the raw edge of a mother's fear, made him pause. He agreed to visit the house again, bringing his worn breviary and a vial of holy water, just in case. What he found was worse than he'd imagined. Robbie was in the backyard, crouched near the oak tree where he and Michael used to build forts. He was scratching at his arms with a stick, drawing blood, his lips moving in a rapid, unintelligible murmur. When Father Bishop approached, Robbie's head snapped up, his eyes cloudy, and he hissed, Pater, cur me spectus? Latin for, Father, why do you watch me? Robbie had never studied Latin, not even in Sunday school. Father Bishop sprinkled holy water, reciting the Our Father, but Robbie laughed a sharp, unnatural sound that echoed across the yard. The priest's journal entry that night was stark. This is no prank. The boy is in danger. The community at Street Agnes began to pull away. Neighbors who once brought casseroles now crossed the street to avoid the Mannheims. Whispers spread. Some said Robbie was on drugs, others that the family was cursed. Harriet felt the sting of their judgment, but she refused to give up. She called Dr. Evelyn Harper again, hoping for answers, but the pediatrician's test showed nothing, no fever, no seizures, just a boy who seemed to be fading. He's under stress, doctor, Harper said, her voice softer now, tinged with unease. But Harriet knew it was more. One night she found Robbie standing in the living room, staring at a crucifix on the wall. The air was thick with that sulfurous smell, and the crucifix was upside down, its wood scorched as if burned. Robbie turned to her, his voice low and wrong. He can't help you now. Harriet fell to her knees, praying through tears, but the room seemed to pulse with a presence that mocked her faith. Michael, caught between loyalty to his brother and fear of what he was becoming, tried to hold the family together. He'd always been Robbie's protector, teaching him to swing a bat, sneaking him extra cookies after dinner. But now, Robbie recoiled from his touch, hissing when Michael tried to hug him. One evening, Michael found Robbie in the garage, surrounded by George's tools, hammering nails into a plank in a pattern that looked like a star. "What are you doing?" Michael asked, his voice shaking. Robbie didn't look up, but his hands moved faster, and he muttered, "It's what they want." Michael grabbed the hammer, and Robbie lunged, his nails raking Michael's arm, drawing blood. Michael stumbled back, his heart pounding, and ran to his room, locking the door. He didn't tell his parents, but he wrote in his journal, "Robbie's not my brother anymore. Something's in him. M's free." Father Bishop, now convinced this was no ordinary case, began preparing for something he'd hoped to avoid. He'd heard of possessions rare, but real in his years as a priest. In Chicago, he'd assisted in a case where a young woman spoke in voices not her own, her body twisting in ways that defied nature. But this felt different, darker, as if the force in the Mannheim house was toying with them, savoring their fear. He contacted the Archdiocese of St. Louis, seeking guidance from Bishop Joseph Cardinal Ritter, a man known for his wisdom and caution. Bishop Ritter, after reviewing Father Bishop's notes, granted permission for a preliminary investigation, a step toward what might become an exorcism. Father Bishop returned to the house with a relic, a sliver of the true cross encased in silver, and a prayer book worn from years of use. He blessed the home, sprinkling holy water in every room, but the air grew heavier, the lights flickering as he prayed. Robbie, confined to his room, screamed a sound that wasn't human, a guttural roar that shook the walls. Father Bishop, undeterred, knelt and prayed, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to reveal yourself." The response was a laugh, cold and deep, that seemed to come from the house itself. As November loomed, the Mannheims were at a breaking point. George, haunted by the voice in his dreams, stopped going to work, his projects piling up unanswered. Harriet, her faith battered but unbroken, spent hours in the church, lighting candles for Robbie's soul. Michael, torn between guilt and fear, stayed late at baseball practice, avoiding the house where his brother was becoming a stranger. And Robbie, poor Robbie, was no longer the boy who dreamed of spaceships and aliens. His body was a battleground, his voice a chorus of something ancient and cruel. The Ouija board, still hidden under his bed, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its letters glowing faintly in the dark. Father Bishop knew time was running out. He'd seen the signs, Latin from an untaught child, objects moving without cause, a presence that mocked the sacred. This was no game, no trick. The Mannheim family was facing a force that had walked the earth since the fall of angels, and it was only beginning to show its power. My friends, this is where the story deepens, where faith is tested in the crucible of fear. The Mannheims didn't choose this battle, but they were in it, and the church, through men like Father Bishop, was called to stand with them. Evil, as I've learned in my years as an exorcist, doesn't always come with horns and fire. Sometimes it's a whisper, a nudge, a board left under a bed. But God's grace is stronger, and that's what we hold to as we face the darkness. The Mannheims were about to learn that lesson in ways they could never have imagined. By October, the air in Street Lewis carried the crisp bite of fall, and the Mannheim house, once a haven of warmth, felt like a place under siege. The disturbances were no longer confined to Robbie's room. In the kitchen, Harriet found her cast iron skillet, a wedding gift from her mother, hanging from the ceiling light, swaying gently as if placed there by invisible hands. The family's old radio, Robbie's prized possession, would crackle to life at odd hours, spitting static laced with garbled voices that seemed to whisper names, George, Harriet, Michael, before falling silent. The cat, Whiskers, had taken to hiding in the basement, its fur bristling whenever it passed the staircase. Harriet, whose faith had always been her anchor, began to feel a weight pressing on her chest, a sense that something was watching, waiting. She'd wake in the middle of the night, her rosary beads clutched so tightly they left marks on her palms, and pray for protection. But the prayers felt hollow, as if her words were being swallowed by the air itself. Robbie, the 12-year-old boy who once lost himself in science fiction, was slipping away. His face, once soft and curious, grew gaunt, his eyes shadowed with dark circles that made him look older than his years. He stopped going to school, claiming headaches that no aspirin could touch. At night, he'd sit cross-legged on his bed, staring at the Ouija board he'd hidden under a loose floorboard. He hadn't touched it since the first disturbances, but he swore it moved on its own, the planchette sliding across the letters in the moonlight, spelling words he didn't dare repeat. "It knows me," he told Michael one evening, his voice flat, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on his arm. Michael, 16 and full of teenage bravado, tried to laugh it off, but the sight of his little brother, once his shadow, now a stranger, sent a chill down his spine. "You're just freaking yourself out," Michael said, but his voice wavered. That night, he heard Robbie muttering in his sleep, words that sounded like a chant, sharp and rhythmic, in a language that made the hair on his neck stand up. George, the engineer who built his life on logic, was fraying at the edges. He'd always been a man of solutions, but no amount of tinkering could fix what was happening. The security camera he'd installed caught nothing but flickering shadows, yet the disturbances grew bolder. One morning, he found his toolbox 20 pounds of steel and wrenches stacked neatly on the dining room table, the lid open, tools arranged in a perfect spiral. He stopped sleeping, his nights spent pacing the garage with a beer in hand, the bottles piling up in the trash. He didn't tell Harriet about the whispers he'd started hearing, not just knocks now, but a low, guttural voice calling his name from the walls. "George," it hissed, "you can't protect them." He'd shake his head, blaming exhaustion, but the fear was sinking in, a cold realization that this was beyond his control. Harriet turned to the church, as she always had in times of trouble. She met Father Raymond Bishop after Mass one Sunday, her hands trembling as she described the changes in Robbie, the dreams, the muttering, the way his eyes seemed to follow something unseen. Father Bishop, a seasoned priest with a voice like rolling thunder, had seen troubled teens before. In his Chicago days, he'd dealt with kids dabbling in the occult, their antics more rebellion than supernatural. But something in Harriet's voice, the raw edge of a mother's fear, made him pause. He agreed to visit the house again, bringing his worn breviary and a vial of holy water, just in case. What he found was worse than he'd imagined. Robbie was in the backyard, crouched near the oak tree where he and Michael used to build forts. He was scratching at his arms with a stick, drawing blood, his lips moving in a rapid, unintelligible murmur. When Father Bishop approached, Robbie's head snapped up, his eyes cloudy, and he hissed, "Pater, curmi spectas," Latin for "Father, why do you watch me?" Robbie had never studied Latin, not even in Sunday school. Father Bishop sprinkled holy water, reciting the Our Father, but Robbie laughed a sharp, unnatural sound that echoed across the yard. The priest's journal entry that night was stark. "This is no prank. The boy is in danger." The community at Street Agnes began to pull away. Neighbors who once brought casseroles now crossed the street to avoid the Mannheims. Whispers spread. Some said Robbie was on drugs. others that the family was cursed. Harriet felt the sting of their judgment, but she refused to give up. She called Dr. Evelyn Harper again, hoping for answers, but the pediatrician's tests showed nothing, no fever, no seizures, just a boy who seemed to be fading. He's under stress, Doctor, Harper said, her voice softer now, tinged with unease. But Harriet knew it was more. One night she found Robbie standing in the living room staring at a crucifix on the wall. The air was thick with that sulfurous smell, and the crucifix was upside down, its wood scorched as if burned. Robbie turned to her, his voice low and wrong. He can't help you now. Harriet fell to her knees, praying through tears, but the room seemed to pulse with a presence that mocked her faith. Michael, caught between loyalty to his brother and fear of what he was becoming, tried to hold the family together. He'd always been Robbie's protector, teaching him to swing a bat, sneaking him extra cookies after dinner. But now, Robbie recoiled from his touch, hissing when Michael tried to hug him. One evening, Michael found Robbie in the garage, surrounded by George's tools, hammering nails into a plank in a pattern that looked like a star. "What are you doing?" Michael asked, his voice shaking. Robbie didn't look up, but his hands moved faster, and he muttered, "It's what they want." Michael grabbed the hammer, and Robbie lunged, his nails raking Michael's arm, drawing blood. Michael stumbled back, his heart pounding, and ran to his room, locking the door. He didn't tell his parents, but he wrote in his journal, "Robbie's not my brother anymore. Something's in him." Father Bishop, now convinced this was no ordinary case, began preparing for something he'd hoped to avoid. He'd heard of possessions rare, but real in his years as a priest. In Chicago, he'd assisted in a case where a young woman spoke in voices not her own, her body twisting in ways that defied nature. But this felt different, darker, as if the force in the Mannheim house was toying with them, savoring their fear. He contacted the Archdiocese of St. Louis, seeking guidance from Bishop Joseph Cardinal Ritter, a man known for his wisdom and caution. Bishop Ritter, after reviewing Father Bishop's notes, granted permission for a preliminary investigation, a step toward what might become an exorcism. Father Bishop returned to the house with a relic, a sliver of the true cross encased in silver, and a prayer book worn from years of use. He blessed the home, sprinkling holy water in every room, but the air grew heavier, the lights flickering as he prayed. Robbie, confined to his room, screamed a sound that wasn't human, a guttural roar that shook the walls. Father Bishop, undeterred, knelt and prayed, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to reveal yourself." The response was a laugh, cold and deep, that seemed to come from the house itself. As November loomed, the Mannheims were at a breaking point. George, haunted by the voice in his dreams, stopped going to work, his projects piling up unanswered. Harriet, her faith battered but unbroken, spent hours in the church, lighting candles for Robbie's soul. Michael, torn between guilt and fear, stayed late at baseball practice, avoiding the house where his brother was becoming a stranger. And Robbie, poor Robbie, was no longer the boy who dreamed of spaceships and aliens. His body was a battleground, his voice a chorus of something ancient and cruel. The Ouija board still hidden under his bed seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its letters glowing faintly in the dark. Father Bishop knew time was running out. He'd seen the signs, Latin from an untaught child, objects moving without cause, a presence that mocked the sacred. This was no game, no trick. The Mannheim family was facing a force that had walked the earth since the fall of angels, and it was only beginning to show its power. My friends, this is where the story deepens, where faith is tested in the crucible of fear. The Mannheims didn't choose this battle, but they were in it, and the church, through men like Father Bishop, was called to stand with them. Evil, as I've learned in my years as an exorcist, doesn't always come with horns and fire. Sometimes it's a whisper, a nudge, a board left under a bed. But God's grace is stronger, and that's what we hold to as we face the darkness. The Mannheims were about to learn that lesson in ways they could never have imagined. Winter had settled over St. Louis like a heavy shroud, the snow piling high outside the Mannheim home, mirroring the weight inside. The house, once filled with the warmth of family dinners and children's laughter, was now a battlefield. The disturbances had grown so violent that the family rarely slept. The walls trembled with sudden, bone-rattling thuds, as if an unseen fist pounded from within. The air carried a constant chill, even with the furnace cranked to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and the sulfurous stench that had once been confined to Robbie's room now permeated every corner. Harriet, her face etched with exhaustion, had stopped counting the sleepless nights. She'd taken to sleeping on a cot in the living room, unable to bear the sounds coming from the guest room where Robbie was now kept. George, his engineer's logic shattered, had abandoned his garage refuge, the whispers in his head now a constant drone, accusing him of weakness, of failure. Michael, at 16, was torn between anger and guilt, spending most nights at a friend's house but unable to escape the image of his brother's twisted face. And Robbie, 13, frail yet unnaturally strong, was no longer the boy who loved science fiction. His body was a vessel for something ancient, his voice a chorus of malice that shook the faith of everyone around him. The Archdiocese, under Bishop Joseph Cardinal Ritter, had granted permission for an exorcism, a rare and solemn step. Father Raymond Bishop, the seasoned pastor of Street Agnes, led the effort, joined by Father William Bowdern, the Jesuit with a keen mind for theology, and Walter Halloran, the former soldier whose strength and resolve were a bulwark against the chaos. They had moved Robbie to the Alexian Brothers Hospital, a Catholic facility with a secure wing designed for such cases. The room was stark, a metal bed bolted to the floor, a small window covered with iron bars, and a single crucifix nailed above the door. Relics lined the walls, a medal of Street, Michael, a fragment of Street Agnes's bone, and a vial of holy water blessed by the bishop himself. Robbie, restrained with padded straps to prevent self-harm, lay on the bed, his body writhing as the priests began their work. The first sessions, held in late January, were grueling, lasting hours, as the voices within Robbie fought back with a ferocity that tested the priest's endurance. Beelzebub, the lord of decay, was the most brazen. During one session, as Father Bishop recited the rite of exorcism, Robbie's voice dropped to a guttural snarl. "You think your words can bind me? I was there when the stars fell." The room shook, the bed frame rattling as if caught in an earthquake. A tray of medical instruments flew across the room, embedding a scalpel in the wall inches from Father Bowdern's head. The air grew thick with the smell of rot, and Robbie's skin, pale and clammy, seemed to ripple, as if something moved beneath it. Father Bishop, his voice steady despite the chaos, held up a silver crucifix and commanded, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I bind you, Beelzebub, and cast you out." The entity laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and Robbie's body arched, his spine bending at an impossible angle, his head twisting to stare at the priest with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Asmodeus, the demon of discord, was subtler but no less cruel. He spoke in a silky, venomous tone, targeting the family's bonds. During a session, as Harriet stood outside the room, clutching her rosary, Asmodeus turned Robbie's face toward her and hissed, "Your husband betrays you, Harriet. He lusts for another." The words cut deep, planting seeds of doubt. Harriet, tears streaming down her face, shook her head, whispering, "That's not true. George loves me." But the accusation lingered, and that night she confronted George, her voice trembling. George, exhausted and haunted, swore he'd been faithful, but the strain in his eyes made Harriet wonder. Asmodeus thrived on this, its voice weaving lies that drove wedges between them. It taunted Michael too. Through letters Robbie wrote in a scrawl that wasn't his own, accusing Michael of abandoning him. "You left me to rot," one note read, found slipped under Michael's bedroom door. Michael, reading it alone, broke down, his guilt a weight he couldn't shake. Legion, the chaotic multitude, was the most unpredictable. Its voices, a chorus of screams, whispers, and wails poured from Robbie's mouth in a torrent. "We are the lost, the damned, the forgotten," it roared as Robbie's body levitated 3 inches off the bed, his straps straining. The room filled with a cacophony, as if 100 souls cried out at once. Objects flew, books, chairs, even the priest's prayer books crashing against the walls. Father Halloran, his oak cross raised, bore the brunt of it, a deep scratch appearing on his forearm, welling with blood. He didn't flinch, his soldier's resolve holding firm. "Just a nick from hell," he said later, bandaging it himself. Legion's presence was a storm, chaotic and relentless, and it left Robbie's body battered, his skin bruised, his lips cracked and bleeding. The priests prayed through it all, their voices rising in Latin, Domine Jesu Christe, Filii Dei Vivi, miserere nobis. But the entities fought back, their laughter echoing through the hospital corridors. The family, allowed to observe from a glass window in the hall, was unraveling. Harriet, her faith, the only thing keeping her upright, prayed ceaselessly, her rosary beads worn smooth. She brought Robbie's favorite blanket, a faded blue quilt from his childhood, and draped it over the bed, hoping it would anchor him to himself. George, standing beside her, was a ghost of the man he'd been. The accusations from Asmodeus had shaken him, not because they were true, but because they exposed his fear that he wasn't strong enough to save his son. He'd stopped drinking, but the temptation lingered, the bottles in the garage calling to him. He began attending Mass daily, sitting in the back pew, his head bowed, whispering prayers he hadn't said since childhood. Michael, still staying with friends, sent a letter to Robbie, written in his messy teenage scrawl. I'm sorry I haven't been there. I'm coming back, I promise. You're still my brother. He left it with Father Bowdern, who placed it beside Robbie's bed, next to the cardinal's cap. The gesture was small, but it was a spark of hope in the darkness. The priests, too, were tested. Father Bishop, his faith forged in decades of service, faced moments of doubt. Beelzebub knew his weaknesses, taunting him about his sister, who died young of tuberculosis. You couldn't save her, Raymond, it sneered, using his first name to mock his authority. Father Bishop faltered, his hands trembling, but he pressed on, his prayers a shield. Father Bowdern, with his theological training, analyzed the entities, noting their patterns, Beelzebub's arrogance, Asmodeus's lies, Legion's chaos. He wrote detailed notes. Believing understanding was a weapon. Halloran, the youngest, brought a warrior spirit, his presence a reminder that faith could be fierce. Together, they rotated shifts, praying through the night, their voices hoarse but unbroken. The hospital staff, sworn to secrecy, whispered among themselves, some refusing to enter the wing after hearing the screams. The sessions grew more intense. One night, as Father Bishop sprinkled holy water, Robbie's body convulsed, his skin blistering where the drops fell. The voices screamed in unison, "You burn us!" The bed shook violently, bolts loosening from the floor. A window cracked, the glass spiderwebbing without cause. Father Bowdern, reading from the Roman ritual, felt a pressure in his chest, as if the air itself resisted his words. Yet he continued, his voice steady, "Exorcizo te omnis spiritus immunde." The entities retaliated, spitting curses in languages, ancient and forgotten Aramaic, Greek, tongues no one in the room could name. Harriet, watching, fell to her knees, her prayers mingling with the priests. George beside her whispered, "God, give me strength." And for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of resolve. The Mannheims were not alone. The church, through Father Bishop and his team, stood as a fortress. But the battle was far from over. The entities were weakening, their taunts growing desperate, but they were cunning, waiting for a moment of weakness. As an exorcist, I've seen how evil tests us, pushing until we break or until we stand firm. The Mannheims were learning that faith is not the absence of fear, but the courage to face it. The next chapter would bring them closer to the edge, but also closer to the light that waits beyond the storm. By February, the Mannheim home on Maryland Avenue was a place of exhaustion and dread. The snow outside had melted into slush, but inside, the air remained heavy, as if the house itself bore the weight of the evil within. The disturbances had grown relentless. The walls no longer just thudded, they groaned, a low, mournful sound like a ship straining against a storm. Lights flickered erratically, bulbs bursting with sharp pops, leaving shards scattered across the floor. The sulfurous stench had become a constant, clinging to clothes and skin, a reminder that the presence was everywhere. Harriet, her once vibrant spirit worn thin, had stopped teaching entirely. her days spent at Robbie's side or in the quiet of Street Agnes Church, her rosary beads now frayed from endless prayer. George, his engineer's precision useless against this foe, had found a fragile strength in his return to faith, but the strain was etched in his face, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Michael, the 16-year-old who once dreamed of baseball stardom, was drifting further from his family, his heart torn between fear for Robbie and shame for his absence. And Robbie, now 13, was a shadow of the boy who loved sci-fi novels and UFO radio shows. His body, gaunt yet unnaturally strong, was a vessel for forces that mocked the sacred, his voice a chorus of malice that chilled the soul. The exorcism sessions at the Alexian Brothers Hospital had become a grueling ritual. Father Raymond Bishop, the steadfast pastor of Street Agnes, led the charge, his voice hoarse from hours of prayer. Father William Bowdern, the Jesuit with a mind sharpened by theology, brought precision to the fight, his notes detailing every word and movement of the entities. Walter Halloran, the former soldier turned seminarian, stood as a pillar of strength, his oak cross a constant shield. The hospital room, with its bolted bed and relic-lined walls, was a fortress of faith, but the entities fought with a ferocity that tested every resolve. Robbie, restrained to prevent self-harm, was a storm of contradictions, his body frail yet capable of unnatural feats, his face that of a child yet twisted with expressions no human should bear. The sessions stretched into the night, the priest's prayers clashing with the entity's screams, the air thick with tension as holy water hissed against Robbie's skin. Beelzebub, the lord of decay, grew more aggressive. During one session, as Father Bishop recited the litany of the saints, Robbie's voice boomed, "Your saints are dust, priest." The room shook, the metal bed frame bending slightly as if squeezed by an invisible hand. A crack appeared in the ceiling, dust raining down, and the temperature plummeted to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the hospital's heating system. Beelzebub spoke of its origins, claiming to have walked the earth since the fall of angels, its hatred fueled by God's love for humanity. "I will rot this boy's soul," it growled, as Robbie's hands clawed at his own chest, leaving bloody welts. Father Bishop, undeterred, held up a relic of the true cross, commanding, "By the power of Christ, I bind you." The entity recoiled, but its laughter echoed, a promise of further torment. Asmodeus, the demon of discord, struck at the family's heart. It turned its venom on Harriet, whispering through Robbie's lips, "Your faith is a lie, woman. Your God has abandoned you." The words cut deeper than any physical blow, and Harriet, standing behind the observation window, clutched her crucifix, tears streaming down her face. Asmodeus knew her fears, exploiting her moments of doubt. It targeted George too, accusing him of sins he hadn't committed: infidelity, neglect until he questioned his own worth. One night, as the priest prayed, Asmodeus spoke in a soft, mocking tone, "George, you let the board into your house. You failed them all." George, his hand shaking, left the hospital, driving aimlessly through the snowy streets, his mind a battlefield of guilt and resolve. Michael, though absent from the sessions, wasn't spared. Asmodeus sent nightmares, vivid images of Robbie burning, blaming Michael for abandoning him. The teen woke screaming, his guilt a weight that kept him from returning home. Legion, the multitude, was chaos incarnate. Its voices a cacophony of screams, laughter, and sobs filled the room like a storm. "We are the forsaken, the chained, the hungry," it roared, as Robbie's body lifted 6 inches off the bed, his straps creaking under the strain. The walls bled, a thick, black ooze seeping from cracks, defying explanation. Father Halloran, his cross raised, bore the brunt of Legion's wrath, a deep gash appearing on his cheek as if clawed by an invisible hand. He wiped the blood away, his voice steady as he prayed, "Lord, deliver us from evil." Legion mocked him, its voices mimicking his wartime comrades, calling their names in anguish. The priests fought on, their prayers a lifeline, but the strain was immense. Father Bowdern, ever the observer, noted the entity's tactics, Beelzebub's brute force, Asmodeus's lies, Legion's chaos. He believed they were weakening, their outbursts more desperate, but the cost was high. The family was fracturing under the pressure. Harriet, her health failing, developed a cough that wouldn't fade, her body weakened by stress and sleeplessness. She refused to leave Robbie's side, bringing small tokens, a photo of the family at a picnic, a worn copy of Robbie's favorite book, The Martian Chronicles, hoping to reach the boy trapped within. George, struggling to hold on to his newfound faith, began meeting with Father Bowdern late at night, their conversations a lifeline. "I'm scared, Father," he admitted, his voice breaking. "What if we lose him?" Bowdern, his eyes kind but firm, replied, "Fear is what they want, George. Faith is what they fear." The words steadied him, and George began carrying a rosary, its beads a reminder of his promise to fight for his son. Michael, still staying with friends, started attending Mass again, sitting alone in the back of Street Agnes, praying for Robbie in silence. He sent another letter, this one read aloud by Father Bowdern during a session. "Robbie, I'm coming home soon. We're going to play catch again, okay?" The words brought tears to Harriet's eyes, a flicker of hope in the darkness. The priests, too, were tested beyond endurance. Father Bishop, his faith a rock, faced moments of doubt as Beelzebub taunted him with memories of his sister's death. "You failed her, just as you'll fail this boy," it sneered. Bishop pushed through, his prayers fiercer, his voice a beacon. Father Bowdern, analytical yet devout, began to see patterns in the entity's behavior, moments when their taunts faltered, when holy water or the name of Christ provoked silence. He shared these observations with Bishop, suggesting they focus their prayers on specific weaknesses. Halloran the warrior bore physical scars, his arms and hands marked by scratches that appeared without cause, yet he laughed them off, saying, "The devil's got a weak swing." Their unity was their strength, a reminder that the church is not one man but a body, bound by faith. The sessions grew more perilous. One night, as Father Bishop invoked the Virgin Mary, Robbie's body spun on the bed, his head twisting unnaturally, his mouth foaming with a black, tar-like substance. The voices screamed in unison, "She cannot save you." A gust of wind impossible in the sealed room tore through, extinguishing the candles. The priests relit them, their hands steady, and continued, their voices rising above the chaos. "Hail Mary, full of grace." The entities fought harder, objects flying, a chair, a Bible, a nurse's clipboard crashing against the walls. Harriet, watching, fell to her knees, her prayers a desperate cry. George, beside her, held her hand, his own prayers halting but sincere. The hospital staff, though bound by secrecy, were shaken. Some refused to enter the wing, their fear palpable. As March approached, the priests sensed a shift. The entity's taunts were laced with desperation, their voices cracking under the weight of relentless prayer. Father Bishop wrote, "They are tiring, but so are we. This is a test of endurance." The Mannheims, battered but unbroken, clung to each other, their love a fragile thread in the storm. As an exorcist, I've seen how evil pushes us to the edge, seeking the moment we break, but I've also seen how faith, even when it wavers, can hold fast. The Mannheims were nearing their breaking point, but the light of Easter was coming, and with it a chance for redemption. March had brought a tentative thaw to Street Lewis, the snow giving way to muddy patches and the first green buds on Maryland Avenue's maples. But inside the Mannheim home, the cold was unrelenting, a spiritual frost that no furnace could warm. The house, once a sanctuary, was now a place of dread, its walls scarred from flying objects, its air thick with the ever-present stench of sulfur. Harriet, her health fraying, moved like a ghost through the rooms, her cough worsening, her hands trembling as she clutched her rosary. She'd stopped sleeping entirely, her nights spent praying or sitting vigil outside the guest room where Robbie was confined. George, his resolve hardened by nightly talks with Father Bowdern, had returned to Mass, but his eyes betrayed a man haunted, the whispers in his mind now, a relentless chorus accusing him of letting evil in. Michael, the 16-year-old who once lived for baseball, was slowly returning to the family, driven by guilt and a desperate need to save his brother. He'd started visiting the hospital, his presence a quiet act of courage. And Robbie, poor Robbie, was a battleground, his 13-year-old body twisted by forces that defied nature, his voice no longer his own but a vessel for ancient hatreds. The exorcism sessions, now moved to a secluded Jesuit retreat house on the outskirts of Street Louis to avoid prying eyes, had become a war of attrition. Father Raymond Bishop, the seasoned pastor of Street, Agnes, led with a weary but unbreakable spirit, his voice a beacon in the storm. Father William Bowdern, the Jesuit scholar, brought clarity, his notes a map of the entity's weaknesses. Walter Halloran, the former soldier, stood as a rock, his physical strength matched by his faith, his oak cross scarred from the battle. The retreat house room was austere, a simple bed, a wooden table, and walls adorned with icons of St. Michael and the Virgin Mary. Robbie, restrained with reinforced straps, was a figure of torment, his body emaciated yet capable of unnatural strength, his face a mask of pain and malice. The sessions, held nightly, were a clash of wills. The priest's prayers met with screams that echoed through the stone halls. Beelzebub, the lord of decay, grew more cunning. During one session, as Father Bishop invoked the name of Christ, Robbie's voice thundered, "Your Savior is a myth, priest. I will bury this boy in rot." The room filled with a sickly green haze, the air choking with the smell of decay, and Robbie's skin blistered, oozing a black ichor that burned the sheets. The bed frame groaned, bending further, and a crack split the floor, as if the earth itself rejected the presence. Father Bishop, his face pale but resolute, held up a blessed candle, its flame steady despite the chaos, and commanded, "By the blood of Christ I bind you, Beelzebub." The entity snarled, Robbie's body convulsing, his limbs thrashing against the straps, leaving bruises that bled under the skin. The priests prayed on, their voices a chorus of defiance, but Beelzebub's laughter lingered, a promise of vengeance. Asmodeus, the demon of discord, struck with surgical precision. It targeted the family's fragile unity, whispering through Robbie's lips to Harriet, "Your prayers are empty, woman. Your son despises you." The words pierced her heart, and she stumbled, clutching the wall, her faith wavering under the weight of doubt. Asmodeus turned on George, its voice sly. "You're no father. You let this happen." George, his fists clenched, fought the urge to flee, his nightly talks with Father Bowdern his only anchor. Asmodeus even reached Michael, who'd begun attending sessions, sitting silently in the corner. During one session, Robbie's head turned, his eyes locking on Michael, and Asmodeus sneered, "You ran, coward. Your brother's blood is on you." Michael, his face crumpling, left the room, his hands shaking as he wrote another letter to Robbie vowing to stay. Asmodeus thrived on these fractures, its lies a poison that seeped into every bond. Legion, the multitude, was a storm of chaos. Its voices 100 screams, laughs, and wails erupted from Robbie's mouth, declaring, "We are the abyss, the chained, the eternal." Robbie's body levitated a full foot off the bed, his straps snapping, his limbs flailing as if pulled by invisible strings. The room shook, icons falling from the walls, their frames splintering. Father Halloran, his cross raised, took a blow, a gash across his chest, deep and bleeding, as if clawed by a beast. He stood firm, his voice joining the others. "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti." Legion's response was a howl, the windows rattling, a cold wind tearing through the room, extinguishing the candles. The priests relit them, their hands steady, their prayers unbroken, but the strain was immense. Robbie's body, battered by the entities, was wasting away, his ribs visible, his skin marked with scratches that appeared without cause. The family, though allowed to observe from a safe distance, was breaking under the weight. Harriet, her cough now a rasp, brought small tokens to the sessions, a locket with a photo of Robbie as a baby, a prayer card from his baptism, hoping they'd reach the boy inside. She prayed ceaselessly, her voice hoarse, her faith a flicker in the storm. George, his resolve growing, began assisting the priests, holding candles during prayers, his presence a quiet act of defiance. He stopped doubting himself, his prayers now fervent, a plea for his son's soul. Michael, returning to the session, sat closer, his eyes fixed on Robbie, whispering, "I'm here, buddy." He brought a baseball, one they'd used in backyard games, and placed it near the bed, a symbol of their bond. The priest noted these acts, believing the family's love was a weapon against the darkness. The priests themselves were tested to their limits. Father Bishop, his faith a fortress, faced Beelzebub's taunts about his past, the demon mocking his failures as a young priest. "You're no shepherd," it hissed. But Bishop's prayers grew fiercer, his voice a thunderclap. Father Bowdern, ever the scholar, saw the entity's desperation, their outbursts more erratic, and urged the team to press harder, focusing on the name of Jesus. Halloran, his body scarred from invisible blows, remained steadfast, his humor a light in the dark. "They're throwing tantrums now," he'd say, wiping blood from his wounds. The priests worked in shifts, their voices blending in Latin. "Exorcizo te omnis spiritus immunde." The entities fought back, but cracks appeared, moments of silence. Brief glimpses of Robbie's true voice, weak but present, calling for his mother. One night, as Father Bishop sprinkled holy water, Robbie's body arched, his scream a blend of human and inhuman agony. The voices of Legion roared, "We will not leave," but faltered, their chorus breaking into discordant wails. A crucifix on the wall glowed faintly, its wood warm to the touch, and the air lightened for a moment. Harriet, watching, gasped, her prayers doubling in fervor. George beside her whispered, "He's still in there." The priests seized the moment, their voices rising in unison, invoking the Virgin Mary and Street Michael. The entities recoiled, but the battle was far from won. Father Bishop wrote later, "We are wearing them down, but they are cunning. Easter approaches, and with it our hope. As an exorcist, I've seen how evil fights hardest when it senses defeat. The Mannheims, battered but united, were finding strength in their love and faith. The priests, scarred but resolute, stood as Christ's soldiers. The retreat house, a bastion of prayer, was the stage for a final stand. The light of Easter was near, and with it, a chance for deliverance. My friends, hold fast to this. Even in the darkest night, the name of Jesus is a fire that no evil can extinguish. April had arrived, and the air in Street Louis carried the scent of blooming dogwoods and the soft warmth of spring. But at the Jesuit retreat house, where Robbie was now held, the atmosphere was heavy, charged with a tension that seemed to press against the stone walls. The Mannheim home on Maryland Avenue had been abandoned as a place of torment, its rooms scarred by the violence of unseen forces. Harriet, her health fragile from months of strain, moved with a quiet determination, her cough a constant reminder of her sacrifice. She'd taken to wearing a small silver cross around her neck, its weight a comfort as she prayed through the nights. George, his skepticism replaced by a fierce resolve, had become a pillar for his family, his presence at the sessions a testament to his renewed faith. Michael, now fully committed to his brother's fight, attended every session, his teenage defiance transformed into a quiet strength. And Robbie, 13 and battered, was a battleground. His body frail, yet contorted by forces that defied human limits. His true self buried beneath layers of malevolence. The exorcism sessions held in the retreat house's chapel-like room were a crucible of faith. Father Raymond Bishop, the weathered pastor of Street, Agnes, led with a voice that carried the weight of decades of service. Father William Bowdern, the Jesuit scholar, brought precision, his observations, noting the entity's growing desperation. Walter Halloran, the former soldier, stood as a sentinel, his oak cross scarred but unbroken, his body bearing the marks of the battle. The room was fortified with sacred objects, a relic of Street. Ignatius, a statue of the Virgin Mary, a chalice filled with holy water, blessed by Bishop Ritter himself. Robbie, restrained on a reinforced bed, was a figure of anguish, his skin pale and bruised, his eyes flickering between moments of clarity and the clouded gaze of the entities within. The sessions, now stretching into the early hours, were a relentless clash of wills. The priest's prayers, a beacon against the storm of evil. Beelzebub, the lord of decay, fought with a savage intensity. During one session, as Father Bishop recited the creed, Robbie's voice roared, "Your faith is a lie, priest. I will turn this boy to ash." The room filled with a choking miasma, the air thick with the stench of rotting flesh. Robbie's body writhed, his skin splitting in thin, bloody lines, as if clawed from within. The bed shook violently, its bolts loosening, and a deep crack spread across the stone floor, dust rising like smoke. Father Bishop, his hand steady, held up a blessed rosary, its beads glowing faintly in the candlelight, and commanded, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I bind you, Beelzebub, and cast you out." The entity's response was a scream that rattled the windows, but its voice cracked, a sign of weakening resolve. The priests pressed on, their prayers a steady rhythm, sensing the entity's strength faltering under the weight of their faith. Asmodeus, the demon of discord, struck with cruel precision. It targeted Harriet's heart, speaking through Robbie's lips in a soft, venomous whisper, "You're alone, mother. Your God has forsaken you." The words brought tears to her eyes, but she stood firm, clutching her cross, her voice rising in prayer. "Hail Mary, full of grace." Asmodeus turned on George, its tone mocking, "You're a failure, man. Your family crumbles because of you." George, his jaw set, met the accusation with silence, his hand resting on Harriet's shoulder, a silent vow to stand together. The entity's lies reached Michael too, as it hissed during a session, "You're no brother, boy. You left him to us." Michael, his eyes wet, shook his head, whispering, "I'm here now, Robbie." He brought a small wooden rocket, a toy they'd built together years ago, and placed it near Robbie's bed, a symbol of their shared dreams. Asmodeus's taunts were losing their edge, its voice growing shrill, as if sensing the family's unity. Legion, the multitude, unleashed chaos. Its voices, a cacophony of screams, sobs, and laughter, erupted from Robbie's mouth, declaring, "We are the endless, the broken, the free." Robbie's body lifted 2 feet off the bed, his straps straining, his limbs twisting as if pulled by unseen hands. The room trembled, the statue of Mary rocking on its pedestal, the candles flickering wildly. Father Halloran, his cross raised, took a hit, a deep gash across his shoulder, blood soaking his shirt. He grunted but held firm, his voice joining the others. "Domine Jesu Christ, libera nos a malo." Legion's response was a howl, the air filling with a whirlwind of debris, papers, candle wax, shards of glass swirling around the room. The priests stood their ground, relighting the candles, their prayers unbroken. Robbie's body, battered by the entities, was a map of suffering, his skin marked with bruises and scratches, his breath shallow and ragged. The family, watching from a small antechamber, clung to each other. Harriet, her voice hoarse, prayed with a fervor that defied her frailty, her rosary beads clicking like a heartbeat. She brought a drawing Robbie had made at 10, a sketch of the family under a starry sky, and held it close, whispering, "Come back to us, son." George, his faith now afire, joined her prayers, his voice halting but sincere. He'd started reading scripture, his engineer's mind finding solace in the Psalms, their words a shield against despair. Michael, his presence a quiet rebellion against fear, spoke to Robbie during breaks, telling stories of their summer games, hoping to reach the boy inside. "Remember when we caught that firefly, Robbie? You said it was a star," he said, his voice breaking. The priest noted these acts, believing the family's love was a sword against the darkness. The priests, too, were pushed to their limits. Father Bishop, his faith a fortress, faced Beelzebub's taunts about his past, the demon mocking his failures as a young priest. "You're no warrior," it sneered. But Bishop's prayers grew louder, his voice a thunderclap. Father Bowdern, his mind sharp, saw the entity's desperation, their outbursts more frantic, and urged the team to focus on the Eucharist, believing its power could break them. He brought a consecrated host, placed in a monstrance on the table, its presence a silent force. Halloran, his body scarred from invisible blows, remained defiant, his humor alight. "They're running out of tricks," he said, bandaging a new wound. The priests worked in unison, their voices blending in Latin. Exorcizo te omnis spiritus immunde. The entities fought back, but their resistance was fraying, moments of silence lengthening. Robbie's true voice breaking through in faint, desperate cries for his mother. One session, as Father Bishop invoked Street Michael, Robbie's body convulsed, his scream a blend of human and inhuman pain. The voices of Legion fractured, their chorus dissolving into a single, plaintive wail. The monstrance glowed faintly, its light cutting through the haze, and the air lightened, the sulphurous stench fading for a moment. Harriet, watching, gasped, her prayers surging with hope. George, beside her, whispered, "He's fighting, Harriet." The priests seized the moment, their voices rising in unison, invoking the Holy Trinity. The entities recoiled, their screams weaker, but the battle was not over. Father Bishop wrote later, "We are close, but the enemy is cunning. Easter is our hope." As an exorcist, I've seen how evil clings to its hold, fighting hardest when cornered. The Mannheims, united in love, were finding strength in their faith. The priests, weary but resolute, stood as Christ's warriors. The retreat house, a sanctuary of prayer, was the stage for a final push. Easter loomed, and with it, the promise of redemption. My friends, hold fast. Even in the darkest hour, the light of Christ shines through, unyielding and eternal. April's warmth had settled over street. Louis, the dogwoods in full bloom, their petals a stark contrast to the turmoil within the Jesuit retreat house where Robbie was confined. The Mannheim home on Maryland Avenue stood empty, its scars, cracked walls, shattered glass, and lingering sulfur too heavy for the family to bear. Harriet, her health frail but her spirit unbroken, carried a quiet fire, her prayers a constant rhythm, her silver cross a talisman against despair. George, transformed from skeptic to believer, stood as a rock, his hands calloused not just from engineering, but from clutching a rosary, his faith a shield forged in the fire of guilt and redemption. Michael, now fully present, had shed his teenage avoidance, his love for his brother a fierce anchor that brought him to every session. And Robbie, 13 and ravaged, was a vessel of torment, his body and soul contested by forces that refused to yield, yet glimpses of his true self, his soft voice, his love for his family began to surface, faint but undeniable. The exorcism sessions, held in the retreat house's fortified chapel, had reached a fevered intensity. Father Raymond Bishop, the weathered pastor of Street, Agnes led with a voice that carried the weight of a lifetime's faith, his eyes burning with resolve. Father William Bowdern, the Jesuit scholar, brought clarity, his notes a lifeline tracking the entity's weakening grip. Walter Halloran, the former soldier, stood scarred but unyielding, his oak cross a battered shield, his presence a reminder that faith could be fierce. The chapel was a sanctuary of sacred power, a monstrance with a consecrated host, a statue of the Virgin Mary, relics of Street Ignatius and Street Michael, and candles that flickered against the onslaught. Robbie, restrained on a reinforced bed, was a figure of anguish, his body emaciated, his skin marked with wounds that bled without cause, his eyes flickering between the cloud of possession and the clarity of a boy fighting to return. The sessions, now timed with the approach of Easter, were a relentless clash. Beelzebub, the Lord of Decay, fought with desperate fury. During one session, as Father Bishop recited the Anima Christi, Robbie's voice thundered, "Your Christ is dead, priest. This boy is mine." The room shook, the floor trembling as if struck by a hammer, and a black ooze seeped from Robbie's mouth, staining the sheets. The air grew thick, the temperature dropping to 35 degrees Fahrenheit, frost forming on the windows despite the spring warmth outside. Father Bishop, his breath visible, held up the monstrance, its consecrated host glowing faintly, and commanded, "By the risen Christ, I bind you, Beelzebub." The entity's scream was deafening, Robbie's body convulsing, his limbs twisting until the straps groaned. Yet the scream faltered, breaking into a choked gasp, a sign of weakening power. Asmodeus, the demon of discord, struck with a final, venomous precision. It targeted Harriet, whispering through Robbie's lips, Your love is nothing, woman. Your son is lost. Harriet, her face pale but resolute, met the lie with a prayer, her voice steady. My son is God's, and you have no power here. Asmodeus turned on George, its tone cruel. You're a coward, man. You'll watch him die. George, his hand on Harriet's, stood firm, his voice joining hers in the Our Father, a defiance that silenced the entity's taunts. Michael, now a constant presence, bore Asmodeus's wrath, the demon hissing, You failed him, brother. Michael, tears in his eyes, placed a hand on Robbie's bed, whispering, I love you, Robbie, come back. He'd brought a worn baseball glove, a relic of their backyard games, and set it beside the wooden rocket, a testament to their bond. Asmodeus's voice grew faint, its lies losing their sting as the family's unity strengthened. Legion, the multitude, unleashed a final storm. Its voices 100 screams, wails, and curses erupted, declaring, We are eternal, unbound, unstoppable. Robbie's body lifted a foot off the bed, his straps snapping, his frame hovering as if held by invisible chains. The chapel shook, candles toppling, the statue of Mary trembling on its pedestal. Father Halloran, his cross raised, took a deep scratch across his neck, blood dripping onto his collar. He stood firm, his voice roaring, In the name of Jesus, be gone. Legion's response was chaos, the air filling with a whirlwind of debris, prayer books, candle wax, shards of wood swirling around the room. The priests relit the candles, their prayers a steady drumbeat, Domine Jesu Christe libera nos. Robbie's body, battered beyond endurance, collapsed back onto the bed, his breath shallow, his skin cold as death. The family, watching from the antechamber, was a united front. Harriet, her cough worsening, prayed with a fervor that defied her frailty, her rosary beads nearly worn through. She brought a letter Robbie had written at 11, a thank you note for a birthday gift, and read it aloud during a break, her voice trembling but strong. Dear Mom, thanks for the books. You're the best. George, his faith now afire, joined her. His prayers no longer halting but bold, his hands steady as he held a candle. Michael, his guilt transformed into resolve, spoke to Robbie between sessions, recounting their adventures, catching fireflies, building forts, his voice a lifeline to the boy inside. The priest saw these acts as weapons, the family's love a force that weakened the entity's hold. The priests, pushed beyond human limits, stood as one. Father Bishop, his faith unshaken, faced Beelzebub's final taunts, the demon mocking his past losses. You're nothing, it hissed, but Bishop's voice roared back, Christ is everything. Father Bowdern, his mind sharp, noted the entity's faltering, shorter outbursts, moments of silence, and urged the team to focus on the Eucharist, its power undeniable. Halloran, his body a map of scars, laughed off the pain, saying, They're scared now, boys. Their unity was their strength, their prayers a symphony. Exorcizo te omnis spiritus immunde. Robbie's true voice broke through in fleeting moments, a weak, Mom, I'm here, that brought tears to Harriet's eyes. On April 16th, Easter Sunday, the final session began under a sky lit with dawn's light. The chapel was bathed in candlelight, the monstrance glowing, the air charged with hope. As Father Bishop invoked the resurrection, Robbie's body arched, his scream a blend of human and inhuman agony. Beelzebub roared, I will return, but its voice cracked, fading into a whimper. Asmodeus, desperate, pleaded, Spare me, I am alone, its tone a shadow of its former venom. Legion's chorus dissolved into a single plaintive cry, We are lost. The room stilled, the air clearing, the sulfurous stench gone. Robbie's body collapsed, his eyes closing, his breath steady for the first time in months. When he woke, his eyes were clear, his voice soft. Mom, I saw hell, but God pulled me back. Harriet sobbed, embracing him. George and Michael joining, their tears a release of months of pain. The priests, exhausted but triumphant, knelt in prayer, thanking God for the victory. Father Bishop wrote, The enemy fled, but faith prevailed. The Mannheims returned to a new home, their old one too scarred. Harriet's health slowly recovered, her journal a testament to their journey, inspiring others. George, free of his doubts, became a pillar at Street Agnes. Michael, his guilt healed, mentored youth, turning pain into purpose. Robbie, later a software engineer, kept the burned Ouija board as a reminder of the light that conquers darkness. As an exorcist, I've seen evil's power, but I've seen God's greater. The Mannheim story is a beacon. Faith, love, and the church can overcome even the deepest darkness. My friends, hold fast to Christ, for in him no evil can stand.